Hey there, and welcome back to 31 Days of Horror. We are on day 22, and today I checked out a Max original, that's HBO Max, called Caddo Lake that came out this year, 2024. Um, it doesn't really have any stars that I recognized, but everybody who was cast and everybody who was featured in this film did an excellent job. All of the characters were very relatable. Um, and it takes place in a rural, small town area in down south United States. Areas that have heavy, like, kind of water population, kind of like the Everglades in Florida, although it doesn't take place in Florida. I'm not entirely sure. Exactly the geographical region. I just know it doesn't take place in Florida because they refer to Florida in the movie as a different place. I also know that I do believe that they shot parts of it in Tennessee, so I know it's generally that area. Um, and it centers around a man who was in an accident with his mother years previous, and he's investigating his mother's diagnosis of having seizures that caused the accident. So he's kind of investigating his mother's diagnosis. He thinks maybe she's been misdiagnosed. And then there's another story that's kind of the main plot of the film of a little girl who I believe she's eight, disappears. And this is a kind of a water community. They, kind of commute to different places in the town via this like kind of system of lakes and waterways that was created by a dam in 1952. And the only reason that the dates in this film are important is because they come up later in the film. There's specific dates. There's 1952, 1999, 2005. And there's a few other dates that years that kind of come up throughout the movie as being significant. And so this little girl goes missing, and like half the town is out looking for this girl. And meanwhile, and we're also following this man who is, kind of researching things about his mother, and he seems to have a job kind of picking up scrap and things from out of the lake areas. So at one point, he's kind of following a pipeline to see where they can disconnect it to scrap it. And the older sister of the girl who's missing, her name is Ellie. The girl who's missing is Anna. And the older sister is, doing everything she can to find her younger sister. There's a disconnect between her and her mother because of never having known or having a relationship with her own father, and there's some resentment there from her mother. There's a lot of family dynamics going on across the entire movie, and that's very significant. So all of those things being said, this is not a traditional horror film. All of the things that you expect to see in regular horror films, you're probably not really going to find that here. I think especially when you're talking about like the bayou type, areas, swamp areas, things like that. I think, we kind of call up a lot of, horror images. There's a ton of things that happen, in the Everglades. There's gators. That's a big one that, that's a real threat. That's not even a horror. So there's gators. That's, that can be scary enough. And we've seen films that, involve a lake where people have disappeared and whatnot. And, we have movies like Lake Placid and things like that, involve the gators or the crocodiles. And then we also have the kind of like slasher horror. You have the entire Hatchet series that takes place in an area very much like this. And a lot of the setting really did feel like the Hatchet films. I ended up watching quite a few of them. I believe I watched the first 3 last year during October for my kind of countdown. And so if you're familiar with those films, the setting is going to feel, familiar in that sense. But that being said, this movie really stays away from a lot of the typical kind of horror tropes, and it really doesn't follow a traditional horror trajectory. That being said, though, the overall concepts, the overall story lend itself very well to horror, but this is really more of like a mystery thriller kind of, suspense type movie. I wouldn't necessarily categorize it as straight up horror, but there are elements that really can be considered horror. Um, so if you're looking for a scare, this is probably not where you're gonna find it. But if you're looking for something that's gonna make you think, and it's gonna kind of, you know, make you feel, then I think this is a pretty good outing. Overall, it was a very good movie. I think if typically you're not really a horror fan, if that's not really your like that's not really your preference of films, but maybe you are, spending time with somebody who really likes spooky season, who really wants, to watch a scary movie with me or watch something. I think this is a really great middle ground for that. Uh, it is a PG-13 movie. That being said, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, because it's not trying to be anything. It's not trying to do anything where the PG-13 rating would really have any effect on the story itself. There's nothing that's lacking because of the lower rating. This is actually a very appropriate rating for the film itself. And I don't think that for me, there wasn't any point in the movie where I was like, oh man, they're trying so hard to get that PG-13 that, like, if they had just done this, like, or if they had just not been vying for that, this whole part of the movie would have been bad. There wasn't anything like that. This is actually a very good story that they were able to tell within that content rating. And I think that's great. On that note, though, I don't necessarily think that the younger demographic would be particularly interested in this film. So, like, I don't think, like, 9 and 10-year-olds are not going to have anything. They're not going to be interested. I think maybe if you're hitting, like, the 15, 16 kind of age range and up, I think that they might gravitate a little bit more towards the storyline, because it does get a bit complicated. Not complicated, but it does get a little bit thinky. I know that's not really a word, but when people sit down to watch a movie, some people sit down because they just want to be entertained and they want it to be mindless for the time that they're sitting down. And there are a lot of horror entries that are great for that. There are a lot of horror entries you don't really have to think about. Mostly slashers, it's just like, okay, you got the dumb teenagers, they're going to make some dumb decisions, and then they're all going to get slaughtered, and then we're going to find out who the killer is in the end, and there's going to be a final girl in the end. And you know what you're going to expect from it. And it's still fun to watch, but it's not you don't have to sit there and think. You're not trying to figure out a story. You're not trying to figure out where it's going. You already know. And a lot of horror is like that, and there's a real benefit to that. Then other horror is, it's very complicated. You're trying to figure out what's going on. You're trying to figure out, how it's all going to wrap up in the end. And a lot of times the ending is ambiguous, or the ending is uncomfortable, or there really is no ending. It's kind of open-ended. Nothing's ever really answered. And when you start getting into a little bit more intellectual territory, when you're talking about horror, you kind of shift the audience, because some people don't want to go to the movies and be educated, or people don't want to go to the movies and have to sort stuff out or think about stuff, or I don't want to say that they don't want to be introspective, but I don't think people really want to think about their lives. They just want to sit down and they want to watch a movie and they want to enjoy it, or they want to enjoy the story or whatnot. I think this movie does a very good job of not going too far into the complicated and, like, science and explanation side of things. But that being said, I think they go far enough where it wasn't, when it ended, I wasn't feeling like, but wait, what? That's it? That's where it ends? Like, what? There's no conclusion to that? Like, whatever. I think they did a very good job explaining what they needed to explain, and then ending it where they did, and not kind of trying to draw it out, and not trying to make some sort of big conclusion out of nothing, or trying to explain more than it was able to explain. And I think that that's really beneficial, and I think that's something that a lot of filmmakers can benefit from, is not trying to explain more than you can explain. I've found there's a lot of movies that where they lose me as an audience member is when they kind of get to a certain point where an explanation is really needed for the audience to kind of understand what's happening, to accept what's happening, or to, kind of remain immersed in the story, because otherwise they're going to be kind of pulled out of it and lose their immersion. And the filmmakers don't really even understand the story that they created, if that makes sense. Um, it happens a lot when you deal with movies that include a lot of science elements, and include like time travel and sort of space travel and things like that are still very complicated, and in real life we haven't entirely figured them out, and the science for what we do have figured out is very complicated. A lot of times when you try to integrate those elements into movies, they get overly complicated, and at some point the writers and the filmmakers don't understand the concept that they're using enough to properly explain it with their narrative. And then things get a little exposition heavy, or they start getting a little too educational, or they just don't get explained because there isn't anybody who knows how to explain it. And that's usually where movies kind of fall off for a lot of people. And a good example of a lot of the movies that I'm talking about is actually Neil deGrasse Tyson, the astrophysicist. He does an entire speaking series where he shows clips of movies, real life movies, and then he analyzes the science in them to see, like, did they get it right? Did they get it wrong? This is why it wouldn't work. This is why this would be an issue, or this is why this is a really great thing. This is how it would work. And this is definitely one of those movies that could have ended up in a talk like that. There's definitely some elements in it that could have very easily lent themselves to being picked apart by an astrophysicist. But I think the filmmakers made a smart decision in only explaining as much as the characters themselves would understand. And that's completely valid as for storytelling, because as readers, we only get the same information that the narrator or the author gives us. So we really only usually have as much, possibly a little bit more, and sometimes even less information than the actual characters themselves have in a story. And it's difficult from a filmmaking perspective, I think, to not visually show the audience more than the characters would know, and also not to use exposition, like to explain more than anybody would really know. I talked about this a little bit when I talked about tarot, is that, you have that kind of like, oh, of course somebody's an expert. This movie stayed away from that, and I really have to commend them on that, because they really did introduce some possibly complicated elements. And I don't mean that in any sort of negative way. They introduced, something weird is happening in the, in the swamp area, in the lake. And they never really said, like, they didn't have like some, creepy lady, who's lived there her whole life, who's like, oh yeah, I can tell you this. Or they didn't have, some geologist who's like, oh, I've been studying the lake. There's been some rock movements, there's a plate under here. Like, they didn't try to over explain anything. And that, I think, is what really leads to the horror. Is because out of everything we experience, nature is probably the scariest thing that we end up experiencing in our lives, because nature created us. Nature created the world around us. We've created a lot of man-made structures, and a lot of our science and a lot of our learning is just trying to understand the world around us. So when it starts doing things that we don't understand, or starts doing things that we don't, know, that can be incredibly frightening. And I think we experience that to some degree with, weather, natural disasters, tsunamis, things like that. I talked a little bit about those things yesterday when we were discussing Knock at the Cabin, because those major kind of weather events and things like that can be so scary, so unpredictable. And when people interact with nature, they're always taking a risk, even if it doesn't seem like it. You know, every time you go out on a boat, you're kind of you're risking capsizing, getting hit by a wave you weren't expecting, you know, having engine trouble and being stranded. And those kinds of things, when you're first, you know, going out, you're like, oh, well, we've got modern technology. I've got a phone. It's, you know, it's got satellite, GPS, all of that stuff. You think you're always prepared. And then, you know, then you have stories about, you know, boats that have capsized, and, you know, you have a man who survived eating ketchup while everybody else on his boat died and he was finally rescued. You have stories like that all the time. And those are purely caused by nature. So then when you encounter movies where there is no real explanation for things, but it is happening in nature, it's the world around us, I think a lot of times the scare is showing us that we don't even really fully understand the world around us, and that sometimes the world around us is dangerous, and sometimes nature and our planet and the things around us are plain and simple just trying to kill us or confuse us or whatnot. um, and so, all of that being said, I had no idea what to expect going into this. It's something that when I get on the, you know, HBO Max website, it's one of the movies that they recommend because it's one of their originals. So obviously they would, you know, promote it. And I figured I would check it out. It had a, you know, an interesting explanation. I didn't really have anything else planned for the day, and I have to say I really enjoyed this. This was different than the other movies that I've watched. I always love to see something different. I love to see new ideas being put out there. I definitely think that it's a world that if they wanted to expand on it, I think there are other things that they can do. And I definitely think there are other horror elements that they can explore with what they've introduced in Caddo Lake if they decided to expand that universe. And if not, I think it makes a great standalone movie. I think it answered all the questions that I had, you know, by the end of it. I think it wrapped up well without really feeling like they went, oh, and then here's the bow on top. Here you go. Like, it didn't feel like, I didn't feel like I was being catered to. I didn't feel like it was a very, you know, like high budget Hollywood movie that wants this happy ending and, you know, a little bow on top. I think it did a very good job of kind of wrapping up in a comfortable area. And I would really love to hear, you know, what you think, because this is essentially, we're getting into, you know, there's Netflix originals, there's Hulu originals, there's Amazon originals, there's HBO originals, and, you know, you name it. If it's a service, they have their own original productions now. And now we're kind of starting to see a resurgence of almost the made for TV movie, because that's really what these are. We don't have traditional TV anymore. You know, people, you know, cut the cord, they're not watching cable. So instead of getting like the USA original movies or the, you know, TNT originals or the Comedy Central original movies, you know, things like that, we're getting the streaming service originals. And so these are the new made for TVs. And I think they can be a little riskier. They have a higher budget. And I think a lot of them are really proving that the streaming services have some good stories to tell. So overall, like I said, I would recommend Caddo Lake. I think I would recommend it mostly for people who are not, you know, huge horror fans, people who are not looking for scares, people who are not looking for anything particularly you know, slashery or traditional horror, people who maybe err on the side of, you know, less swearing, less violence, less horror, and more thrill, mystery, confusion, you know, kind of feeling-ish tension movies, then I would recommend this. So I would love to hear your thoughts down below. And, you know, we're on day 22. I've got 9 days left in the month, 9 movies left to watch before, you know, Halloween. If you have any recommendations of movies that I haven't mentioned here that you think I might enjoy, or that might be, you know, new, different, interesting, exciting, leave a comment down below and, you know, give me a recommendation. Subscribe if you feel like, you know, checking out my other videos. We have 21 before this one, so there's plenty to watch, and I will talk to you tomorrow. Have a great day.